So I'm very pleased to welcome our latest guest. He's the founder, CEO, and producer of The Authority Hive by Mr. Thrive Media, as well as the chief marketing officer for HLA, and also the host of Bad Jew, which is the 17th largest Jewish podcast in the world. Very impressive. Chaz Volk, thank you so much for being with us today.
Colin, it's a real treat to be here, and I want to thank you for having me on your platform to discuss the topic matters and whatnot regarding Israel, regarding Judaism, regarding the neighborhood of Los Angeles. And let's get into it.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So you just returned from Israel. Welcome back.
Thank you. Yeah, it was one of the most memorable trips of my lifetime, for sure.
Really? So, how was the Holy Land?
So I've never been to Israel during wartime. This is my first time in Israel during that time, and it's like everything is the same, but it's different at the same time. And so, for example, I was primarily staying in the old city of Jerusalem. I was actually with Aish Torah at the yeshiva. And, of course, right next to the Jewish quarter is the Arab quarter. And, more than ever before, we were made aware of the tension that is kind of pointed in our direction there. I definitely felt safe, but it's that safety that comes with, that people are kind of looking at you with a negative connotation all of a sudden. And so, in a strange way, that added to the experience in the sense that it emphasized certain points that were made. And it made me think about things very differently than I'd ever had when it came to Israel.
Interesting. And so can you tell us about some opportunities for other people that might be interested in going, particularly, if they need to subsidize the trip somehow?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think right now, everybody, every Jew at that should right now try to find a way to volunteer for Israel. Israel currently is having an influx of people moving there as we speak, because I think that people feel that with this attack, that being in Israel couldn't be more important in this time. But as for like resources that actually can get people there, so Birthright through Taglit has incredible resources. They're regularly updating their volunteer opportunities, and they're getting groups of people to go. And by the way, this is not just for young people. They have a trips where it's a wide range of people from 20 to 50, I believe, if I remember correctly, the age range. I could be wrong about that, so don't quote me on that. But ultimately, there are opportunities out there through Birthright. I would also, because as the guy who works for Aish Torah, I would go ahead and start looking up what programs Aish Torah has, especially if you're a young adult. And I would also, lastly, just honestly, just see what volunteer opportunities are out there. I would a simple Google search, you'll find actually a bunch, because right now funders want Jews around from America to go there to experience this, to see firsthand, to bear witness what has taken place, and to also put the labor in there for sure.
Right. Okay. And so, is Aish Torah connected to Aish and HLA?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So when I was it was funny because when I was there in H Los Angeles, and I would tell them, "Oh yeah, I'm the chief marketing officer of HLA." I suddenly realized that was a total badge of honor. It was a total flex on my part, and people very much looked at me a little differently because of that. So there's a different connection, and I got the chance also to meet Jamie Geller, who's their chief marketing officer. And also, if anyone here is familiar with the social media accounts for H.com, I also got to meet Naomi Silver. I also got to meet some amazing people in the back end that I've had the pleasure of working with from afar.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, I was going to ask you to tell us a little bit more about Aish in general. They become kind of my go-to in terms of articles and activism. Great way to keep up. But yeah, maybe for people that aren't really familiar, you could give a little bit of a breakdown or history, or maybe talk about how long you've been working with them.
Sure. I mean, so as much as I understand, Noah Weinberg was the person who founded the yeshiva and founded the organization in 1974. And when they told us an amazing story about how he got the building, but essentially he had a very unique deal. He was able to get the building that looked straight from the hotel, and he got this incredible property for half the price, like sorry, even like a quarter of the price of what it actually costs today. He was very fortunate. It was really a blessing for him to acquire the space in which it has happened. And yet, when you go to H Store right now, there's actually, you'll notice at the very base near the entrance, it's actually a lot of construction. And that's because it's literally on top of an archaeological dig. So there's like artifacts of ancient Jerusalem being found every single day, and you see archaeologists going down there to recover these amazing artifacts regularly. But the big thing that Noah Weinberg taught, and really what his yeshiva was founded on, is the idea that Jewish wisdom and Torah study can sometimes come across black and white and very robotic and two-dimensional. It has to be this way, or else you're wrong. And he came in still respecting the way that traditions have been, and said, we're going to teach things very differently. We're going to make sure that people at this yeshiva understand that um, you can still be your own individual self and embrace the lessons of Torah and get closer to Hashem, and to really live a true life of Devaikus. And so, that's why today you have these amazing figures like Rav Dov Ber, who collaborated with Nas Daily while he was there. You also have these amazing. One of my favorite teachers was this guy named Rav Berger. Also, you have Rav Gov. And, these are some famous names that have done tours in Los Angeles and in the world, for that matter, to talk about their work and to pass along different ideas. But these are these amazing rabbis that, if you looked at their personalities by themselves, you wouldn't actually know by the personality alone that they were rabbis of Orthodox background. And so they've come and they've taught that. In general, is a Kiruv organization, bringing you closer to your Torah studies and whatnot. And I've been involved with them now for like 7 years, which is amazing. And it's taken me a while, but I finally have gotten to that point of embracing this identity and this journey, and it's made my life that much better.
Hey, wow, good to know. Yeah, a lot of people forget rabbi literally translates just as teacher. So it's not, yeah, like you said, that whole black and white world of, I mean, a lot of people, especially in America, and a lot of Jewish Americans might feel like, oh, I'm not really religious, I'm more independent. But, it just because, we can appreciate some of the people that have come before us, learn a little bit more out of that. That's not in any way like a threat to your individuality,
No,
it's just learning. You
well
know,
said. Yeah.
so what do you think people need to know most about Israel right now, especially for some of the naysayers and negaholics out there?
Sure. So I'll say this from a I'll split this up into Zionist versus those who are skeptical or less than Zionist. For the Zionists that are out there right now, they need to understand they need to go to Israel and help wherever they can. They need, and you might say to yourself, well, wait, I'm just one individual person. What can my labor possibly do? What can my presence there possibly do to actually make Israel a safer and stronger place? And the answer is, you just being there helps those that have been living in Israel, who have felt alone and isolated. You're reinvigorating their hope. You're giving them you're giving them this reminder by you being there that they need you, that you're needed. And I think that's been one of the biggest pain points for all Israelis that are local there, is that they feel alone. They feel hopeless. They feel like they're in a never ending war because they're fighting a war against an enemy that is not playing this by the same rules they are. And on top of that, you have the influence of the entire world. That's a very loud group of people that do nothing but spew hate. And they're not there to have a dialogue, as that side has preached for some time. They're not there to create bridges between communities. They're there in the most nefarious nature to create as much chaos as possible, to gaslight as much as possible. And we cannot tolerate that anymore. And the only way we can fight that fight, is to be there for our own people. That's the first thing. The second thing is, to the people that are less than Zionist, what I recommend you do, if you're actually listening to this podcast, is, if you're noticing that your algorithms are solely based on anti-Zionist information and propaganda, then I strongly suggest you get propaganda from the Zionist side as well, or information from the other side as well. I'm using the word propaganda very liberally here, by the way. But make sure that your narratives that in the news that you're receiving the information from come from multiple angles on this, because it's not a black and white situation. I can tell you right now, I'm here right now working my way. I'm on my Jewish journey. I'm trying to be Baal Teshuva. I'm trying to grow Jewishly. And, you would automatically think from what you've just heard that I'm only listening to Zionist infomedia and Zionist media. And yes, while I definitely tend to agree with that side, I'm also simultaneously listening to the other side as well. I'm very, very attentive to that. And it's important to be that, to start hearing the other sides of this, because you need to understand how they're getting to that train of thought. No one just woke up one day and said, "Oh, I'm going to go hate these people. I'm going to go start a war." They got there somehow. Now, as to my Zionist audience that just heard me say that, the one thing I want to make clear when I just said that, I am by no stretch of the imagination an anti-Zionist, anti-Semite sympathizer. I think it's a sad, despicable truth. What I'm more so getting at is that we need to have a more dimensional outlook on this, because if we keep on repeating the same mistakes we've been doing, this is only going to continue more and more. This cycle of hate, this cycle of violence, this cycle of not being able to have communications and dialogue is not going to be practical. Someone that I very much value in the way that he handles himself is a content creator by the name of Rudy Israel. Rudy Israel has gone onto campuses and has had these dialogues. And the reason why he's able to do so as a veteran who has literally been emotionally charged by serving in Gaza and in previous conflicts before that, while still being able to have meaningful dialogues and conversations, is because he is listening to the other side. He is finding a way. He is trying to understand their side, so that way he can understand how they got there to try to untangle the intellectual web that has been created.
Right. Yeah. It's a lot of great points there. First of all, I love the idea of kind of just being there. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's what mentors are all about. It's not necessarily, well, yeah, I mean, just voting with your feet also. We vote in so many ways: the businesses we choose to support, the places we choose to spend our time in. I know I was teaching at an Orthodox Jewish boys high school a couple of years ago, and I was told, like, they made it quite clear in the teacher's manual, hey, you have to accommodate absences, because in the Orthodox Jewish community, a wedding might take like several weeks because they go out of town, they spend time with all their family members. It's a big deal. Plus, yeah, a lot of different religious occasions, but also people, like, I noticed around Hanukkah time, a lot of students were making trips to Israel. And I was like, oh, is there a wedding out there? Is there a bris that you're attending or something like that? And they're like, no, it's just a mitzvah. And I'm like, wow, that is so great. What a good thing to do. Like you said, just kind of showing your support, showing that love, and just being there goes a really long way. And I just wanted to respond. Yeah, it's interesting, your point about propaganda, because a lot of times, I'll be out and about, in the real world, and someone will bring up the encampments, and I'll think like, oh yeah, they're pointing out how ridiculous some of these encampments, some of the treatment of the Jewish students are. And then I'll kind of, chime in, and they're like, no, 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 I'm for the encampments. And, once the shock subsides a little bit, I'll just, maybe ask a question like, do you know what is the only country in the Middle East that actually has legalized gay marriage? And, they refuse to even answer me or engage. They say, that just sounds like propaganda. And it reminded me of like a few years ago when, if you shared any kind of factoid that somebody didn't like, they would just say fake news. And it's almost like propaganda has become the new go-to. It's just like, I don't want to hear it. And I love your point about, there's nuance to all this. There's just because you're supportive of Israel doesn't mean you're not critical necessarily of Netanyahu or things like that. A lot of people think that all Palestinians are Arabic, when there's plenty of Jewish Palestinians, there's plenty of Arab Israelis. It's always been pretty multicultural. I mean, even Abraham, I remember when I learned that he was Hiskos, which was a Greek word for both Semitic and Arabic. And then you read about, the mixed multitudes that marched with Moses out of Egypt. Now, I know some of these stories might have been exaggerated a little bit over time, to convey an even greater truth. But yeah, I think a lot of people forget about the dynamism out there, and the inherent multiculturalism. So, I mean, speaking of Netanyahu, what do you think? Is he doing more to help the Zionist cause or hurt us right now?
It's a complicated answer, because you hear one narrative when it comes to being critical of the Knesset specifically, uh, and this narrative is that Netanyahu wants to elongate the war so that way he can stay prime minister. On the other hand, you hear a narrative where he is trying to create an outright victory so that way this never happens again. Um, I believe there's truth to both of those statements. I believe that, and this is not me speaking as a political leader, and I'm definitely not a political leader on Israel politics, how the coalitions work and whatnot. But what I can tell you is that the fact that Netanyahu was under pressure and a lot of legal heat before the elections took place, before he got elected, before this war even started, does not help his situation. And um, as for actually completing this war and actually creating an outright victory, I'll tell you on a personal level that it does scare me to hear sometimes that the U.S. like I see these reports, oh, the U.S. is getting inches and inches closer to an actual ceasefire deal, and it's like, well, that ceasefire, no one really knows the detail of this from afar because we're just hearing vague terms right now. We're just hearing headlines as of right now, but it still scares me to hear the phrase ceasefire because ceasefire does not mean peace. It really just means we'll wait for another opportunity to October 7th. So you don't have to like the trip to the destination. You're eventually going to get to the destination, but you don't have to like it. And so at the end of the day, I still want Netanyahu to complete the job. Uh, Hamas needs to be eradicated forever. It just needs to happen. There is no other solution. Um, even if it's not Sinwar is just one person. At the end of the day, you're not fighting an army. You're not fighting you're not fighting just a group of guys. You're not just fighting a gang. You're fighting an ideology. And there's this great movie with Brad Pitt, I believe. I could be mistaken in the name of the movie, but I think it's called War Machine.
Oh,
And Brad Pitt plays this general, and he's explaining how math works in the war against terrorism. And he explains, well, normally the way that math would work is that 2 minus 2 always equals 0. But as a matter of fact, when it comes to the war on terrorism, 2 minus 2 actually equals 4. And the reason why is because those people are always connected to others. And the more chaos you bring back, and the more that you have justified action to respond, and the more that you actually do successfully respond, the more you'll incite others to follow through. And so that's the current uphill battle that we fight. The nature of being a Zionist, the nature of defending the land of Israel is Sisyphean.
oh, interesting. Some mythology there. Um, okay, and what do you think are some of the biggest misnomers about Judaism in general?
I think people when they think of Judaism from afar, they see say the word Jew out loud and see what image pops into your head first. For a lot of people, it's the Haredi image, the black and white outfit, long straggly beard, payas, and then not to mention bubbled up, walled off community, very little dynamic, possibly even a little bit of sexism in this community. That might be what you might be imagining. You know, I actually, as someone who's been in the involved in the frum world for some time, it's a little hard for me to play that game anymore. Of like, oh yeah, what do I imagine when I hear that? Because I personally know that it's not like that everywhere you go. That it's a much more dynamic and colorful world beyond what your imagination might jump to right away. Especially, by the way, with the podcast that I've been producing, Bad Jew, you know, I've if you go to my podcast and you look at the cast of characters I've had, you can tell, first of all, that no two characters are the same, no two sexualities are the same, no two genders are the same on the show. We've had a wide variety of people come on the show, and the whole entire point of my podcast is that there's no such thing as a bad Jew. There's no such thing as a bad Jew. And we've had these amazing figures come on, like Shoshana Stein, like Yuri Cohn, like Aliza Ben Shalom from Jewish Matchmaking, like Roz Rothstein from Stand With Us, like Eliza Klein from One Table, Kosha Dills, the rapper. We've had these amazing figures. We've had Chabad rabbis on. We've had David Brzozowski, the tattoo rabbi. We've had the TikTok Rebbe, Rabbi Raps. I can go on forever about the amazing people that we've had on the show. We've had IDF soldiers. We've also had survivors. We've had friends of families that were harmed by October 7th. And we continue to push different narratives. But the bottom line is that if you bubble up Judaism into idea, this two-dimensional idea of, they're all the long straggly beard folk with the suits, and they have the really fun fuzzy hats, and the women are always pushed into a box, and the sex is, no, they're all homophobic as well, and all blah 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 blah, right? um it's clear to me that you haven't asked enough questions and that you're actually not interested in growing your intellect as an individual, as a human. uh we in today's society forget to ask questions. We forget to come and approach things in an open-minded way. If we do ask questions, we'll sometimes ask with an agenda behind it, which is disingenuine approach to learning. And Judaism is all about having a genuine approach to learning. If you look at the Talmud, just the nature of the Talmud alone, right? If you look at the Mishnah, it's literally the world's largest record of arguments that have taken place among sages and Torah scholars from generation to generation, and none of them agreed with each other. But all their statements were recorded, and yet we're all part of the same family. Just as you can imagine a very controversial Thanksgiving dinner, right? And you have that uncle that no one talks about that shows up every year, and you invite him because you have to, and it's begrudgingly awful to deal with that figure. And he makes it awkward every time because he brings up his politics at the table, and it gets to the awkward, and then people start shouting at each other, and then you have the dogs barking at something outside, and it's just absolute chaos. People are throwing forks at each other, like that one episode in The Bear. Like that's what the Talmud is.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, there's still so much love behind it. If you could take all that chaos and then you could package into a present and wrap it up in a nice delicate bow, and that delicate bow is called love. That is what Judaism is.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating how debate is kind of inherent to Judaism. Once I
Yeah.
learned what you're talking about with the Talmud, I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
no wonder I'm so argumentative. And I've actually been teaching speech and debate classes since 2013, and I
Oh
realized,
wow.
yeah, and even just the way I do my classes, even I was raised in a secular home, but still, I start to recognize those little bits of Jewish wisdom here and there. But also, that's another big misnomer for me, anyway, is that some people act like all religions are cults. It's like, oh yeah, if you're small, you're just a cult. Once you get big enough, they call you a religion. But cults tend to be very secretive, very threatened. You look at what some of the Scientologists have done to get some of their enemies, sue. They even imported books into certain, foreign countries just so that they could sue them for libel. They tried impersonating. I'm forgetting the woman's name, but she was a big critic of the Scientologists in the 70s, and they started sending out impersonators of her to try and get her either arrested or thrown in a mental asylum. And I'm like, to think that our people who are just, filled with these vigorous debates, we disagree with each other constantly, we're frequently changing our minds and stuff. That's the exact opposite of a cult or a dictatorship. That's democracy. But yeah.
I think that's well said. I would like to add to that and just say that, like, it's common for human beings to create a sense of tribalism around almost everything they do. You know, Judaism, sure, it's a tribe. In fact, it's technically 12 tribes put together, right? But let's go on a more micro scale. You know, let's talk about with among the Jews, right? You have a split of politics, and those are two tribes in itself, right there. Let's go even deeper and let's talk about something as simple as how someone eats their specific diet, right? Veganism is a type of tribe, so to speak. So is eating kosher. The group that eat the part of Judaism that actually embraces kosher, eating kosher, is a tribe in itself. Let's go even deeper. Let's take another micro tribe, if you will. Gun owners are a tribe of people. And the people who drive cars versus the people who don't know how to drive cars is a tribe of people. So the bottom line is humans, it's in human nature to have a certain sense of tribalism, and oftentimes where we get a lot of division is when we get so wrapped up in our own personal tribalism, in our own little identities that make up who we are, that we forget about the bigger picture. I've heard people make statements like, oh, if my son ever uh let's say bought a gun, I would disown him. And it's like, what? You mean because your son figured out something logical that made sense to him, you would disown him? Something like that, right? Um, we make that mistake all the time. But in reality, I actually don't know any parent that would actually say anything like that. But the bottom line is that there are people out there that do that, and again, it comes from that place of um, romanticizing what your tribalism and your personal identity has been marked by, and getting so wrapped up in it that you forget about the morals and values that you were raised with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even within the firearms topic, there's such a variety. I mean, it's really hard to compare like a woman who keeps a really small revolver in her purse because she lives in a dangerous part of town. How do you compare that to like an AR-15 or something like that? So you know Myron Sugarman?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I know him. Yeah.
I actually got to meet him when he was doing his speaking circuit. I think promoting his Last Jewish Gangster book, and I remember he made a point in the lecture that every Jew should own a gun, and he was making a good point basically about we're never safe, even in a country. I mean, that's why America is so great, right? It's woven into this idea of religious tolerance as part of our founding documents, but you never know. I mean, look at the Supreme Court could get even more radicalized. There's no telling. So while he was making a good point, I also felt like there was a big generational divide because back when he was fighting Nazis and thugs, there may not have been as much mental illness out there, and maybe not every single Jew should own a gun, because there are people who hey, I don't even want it around because I might have suicidal issues or things like that, so just keep it away from me.
It's an
um
interesting point. Yeah.
so besides debate, what are some of your other favorite Jewish contributions to the world at large?
It's amazing because I would say that there are so many ideas that people automatically assume are very secular ideas that are actually not, that they're totally rooted from Torah. For example, the weekend. We all like weekends. No one actually, I mean, like you think to yourself, oh, it's natural. Of course, human beings need a break. But it's like you realize that Jews invented the weekend, bro. Like we had this idea of Shabbat, and before the industrial era in America, right? It was the expectation to show up on Saturday or to start to have a regular 7-day work weeks until they unionized. The unions were the ones who took from Judeo-Christian values and said, you know what, we should just do our own version of Shabbat, not a religious Shabbat, just like a secular version of Shabbat. And then we're going to put this gap in the middle of the work week. And then people can then have that time to go do whatever they need to do on the weekends. Like, it'll be great. It'll be awesome. And then, so unions borrowed the idea of the weekend from the Jews without even knowing it. And, or at least not intentionally doing it. Take another instance of something, a wonderful Jewish contribution like astrology, which you might say, wait a second, that's not a Jewish idea. That comes from East Asia. Well, it's like, yeah, it does, but you have to understand there were trade routes that went to the Middle East, and the idea of astrology came through. And so, because we had the lunar calendar, it made a lot of sense. And there is a whole entire study of Jewish astrology that we have. We actually did an episode about that on my podcast, Lorelei Kood, who does Jewish astrology, where you can do a little bit of fortune telling with that. It's really, really fun. It's a real thing that was practiced. Part of the reason why it fell out of practice amongst Jews in common ground is because of the Holocaust, because so many of those that would actually practice and study and look at astrology perished in the gas chambers, unfortunately. So it's very interesting. There are these different ideas that really do come from Judaism, and it's not really acknowledged anymore because it's so secularized and so kind of lost and buried within history.
Right, right. Yeah, and I wish more people knew about all of the religious Jews that would get fired every single Friday because basically they came, during that pre-industrial time you were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not about trying to convert people or the propaganda thing. It's just like, hey, give a little bit more credit where it's due and know your history. And yeah, we could talk about Moses kind of being the original labor organizer too, kind of the beginning of representative democracy in a lot of
That's a
ways.
great way to put it, definitely.
And well, and even veganism, you had mentioned that in some ways is an offshoot of the kosher school of thought, because originally it was not just about what animals you could and couldn't eat, but how the animal was killed, because it had to be done in a way that minimized the suffering, right?
Right. In a lot of ways, vegan is the original kosher. So before the great floods that Noah and his ark survived, we ate vegan. Us Jews, we all ate vegan or vegetarian at least.
Really?
And only after the floods did we, as a people, we almost kind of had some kind of a compromise with Hashem, and that's how we had the rules and the laws of kosher. There's a deeper study in there that I'm not quite an expert in, but these are the broad strokes of kind of how we got the laws of kashrut today.
Interesting. I've heard that a lot actually, that ours is definitely a religion of compromise. And that part, in some ways that lends itself to a lot of these misnomers, because I've heard it said a lot that like, hey, Jews actually used to be kind of more polytheistic and worship a lot of different gods. But I think it was that, ethical monotheism was still such a new thing. And a lot of the Canaanites, they might go into the temple. I mean, there were mixed marriages, blended marriages, things like that, intercultural marriages back then. So maybe one person had more of an idea of, ethical monotheism, and someone else was like, okay, where do we do the sacrifice? And so, yeah, some of the animal sacrifices, when you read about those, it wasn't so much like, yeah, we sacrifice animals because we want to incorporate all this, old world stuff. It was more like, no, people were still doing sacrifices. So you want to compromise. And also, sacrificing an animal is a heck of a lot better than child sacrifice, human sacrifice, which were going on in the world at the time. And at least with an animal sacrifice, you can feed people, including the poor.
Absolutely. And the ideas behind sacrifices did change once we got the temples, because sacrifices were also in many ways offerings to the Kohanes, which are the high priests of the Jewish people. And what's kind of amazing. I heard this while I was in Israel just recently for the 2.5 weeks that I was there, and that is that um, I don't know if it's calculated or if it's the rabbinic law behind it, but the idea is that a Kohen only has to work 2 weeks out of the year if they had a temple. If there was a temple, they would live in the temple for 2 weeks and receive those sacrifices. So uh, a lot of the forgiveness that takes place, what's called teshuva, is offering an animal to the Kohen so they can survive and eat within the temple while working and worshiping Hashem. So they weren't just burning sacrifices. They weren't just like taking a poor animal and randomly just burning it alive in front of everybody in this like sadistic way. There was an offering to the Kohanes as well. And so the Kohanes, the way they digested it and consumed the animal was on behalf of Hashem. That was the mentality of it.
Wow. Yeah, and for people that don't know, Kohen is basically a high priest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, did you know that the Irish word for high priest is also Kohan?
I did not know that.
Yeah. So it's just it's so fascinating to see what a small world it really is. I've heard that
Really?
it might
Yeah.
have had something to do with like Genghis Khan, because he did control the British Isles like around the year 1000, I guess.
Fascinating. Okay. I did not know that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I had a friend. He was like my best Muslim friend, you could say, for a little while. Really more of a coworker, but he went by James. And then I remember like accidentally, like it was a kind of situation where you have to flip through everyone's pay stub envelopes to get to yours. They just had them all together. So I was like picking up my paycheck one day, and I saw that his name was actually more like Genghis. And I'm like,
Hmm.
oh, so James is just a nickname. Now he's actually wanted, I think, still by the Iranian army for
Oh
being,
my God.
because yeah, I mean that's why people forget that the US and Israel are really like sanctuaries for a lot of people that have had to flee these ruthless dictatorships. So yeah, he got out of Iran. But he told me that like, yeah, Chengiz is really just the Persian version of Genghis.
Wow.
And then I thought, yeah, and James, you've got that in Ireland. Seamus is basically the Irish version of James. So when
Mhm.
it's Jameson, it's like Seamuson. So I started to connect the dots, and yeah, it's really, really fascinating. And none of this stuff is unique to any one country, because people have always moved around. And like I said, it's always been a lot more multicultural, our lineage, than people think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what made you decide to study film?
So back in the day growing up, I think I had a best friend who I really looked up to in a lot of ways named Nick. Shout out to Nick Benjamin. And I saw the way that he was going. I saw how passionate he was, and I was very inspired by his passion for the love of film. And I wanted to get into it. So I went to San Francisco State, went to their film school, and one of the best lessons I ever got was actually on the first day of film school. It was like they have an introduction to film school class, and it's like 100-person theater that you're sitting in. And the professor got up in front of everybody and he said, "All right, I want to get a survey for the classroom here. Like, who's in my classroom? So raise your hand if you one day want to be grip and electric." And like, no one raised their hands, crickets. Raise your hand if you want to get into audio. And maybe like a dozen guys raised their hands. Raise your hand if you want to get an animation. Okay, it's about now a quarter of the room raise their hands. Okay, raise your hand if you want to be a director. Everyone raise their hand. Raise your hand if you want to be a screenwriter. Everyone raise their hands. Raise your hand if you want to be a producer. Everyone raise their hands. And suddenly I realized, you know what? I am the same exact individual from this teacher's perspective as everyone else's. Like there's nothing about me that differentiates me. And so one of the smartest decisions in my life was that in that moment I decided, okay, like, okay, yes, I'm still going to pursue screenwriting. I'm still going to pursue directing film. I'm still passionate about this, but I also need to study some other things. I need to have a wide variety of understanding here. So I studied a little bit of animation. Wasn't the best at it. I had fun drawing. That was fun. But I really got in my audio. And if I didn't ever have that mindset to diversify my understanding of film, and in general what I could do with it, then I wouldn't have gotten to podcasting, and I wouldn't be here with my own company, working for HLA, producing the 17th largest Jewish podcast. These things would have never happened.
Yeah, I mean, storytelling takes more than just a writer and a director. I kind of had a similar story because I wound up getting a theater degree. I was originally a history major, but then I got offered a scholarship to be an apprentice at Stevens College, which is a
Wow.
liberal arts school in the Midwest. But because of the apprenticeship and also just the way their program is set up, you have to put in some time. I mean, you got to earn your keep. It's not just about, hey, I want to be the person on stage. It's like, no, you have to know how lighting works. I mean, and now, I mean, I feel like with Zoom, when everyone was basically working from home for a couple of years there, yeah, a lot of us were stepping up our lighting game because it's like, oh, yeah, even if I'm just working from home, it's still, there's so many different ways to light yourself, but also, yeah, just learning about all the different things that go into it. It almost reminds me of one of my favorite JFK quotes. He said, mothers all want their sons to grow up to be president, but they don't want them to become politicians in the process. And that's kind of it. It's like, you got to know what it takes. You got to know, get your hands dirty and see all the work that goes into it.
That's a really good point. That's a really, really good point. I like that concept a lot. And it's like, I actually went to the JFK museum earlier this year. So when you said that, I was like, oh wow. One thing that's really inspired by JFK, this probably has nothing to do with the podcast, but I always just think about it. So you triggered it, so I'm going to bring it up. Is that the first part of the museum that you see are JFK's report cards and different reports that his teachers gave wrote about him. Do you know what kind of student John F. Kennedy was?
Well, I'm assuming he wasn't that great.
No, he was terrible. All his teachers said that he would never amount to anything because they didn't see anything. And he was a troublemaker. He was a troublemaker, and he was a little bit of a daredevil, and he did things on his own in his own way. He did not pay attention in school. Um, no teacher ever thought that he was going to make anything of himself. And then later he went to Harvard, and then later he became the president. Like it's JFK is an amazing American success story.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that speaks to many things, kind of just the rigidity of our educational system. I mean, when people think about dictatorships and cults, I think a lot of our school system is more like it than any religion. But it also reminds me of Einstein, too, because he was considered a really poor student, at least when it came to pocket change and things like that. And I related to that. I kind of dropped out of school for a little bit. I was dealing with a lot of family problems and whatnot, and I just couldn't bring
Mm.
myself to go to school every day. And it's just like, yeah, well, they don't facilitate people that have, I mean, just now we're finally starting to talk about, kinesthetic learning and audio learners versus visual learners and kind of trying to have a more dynamic approach where we incorporate those different learning and teaching styles. But back then it was just, hey, you're either getting it or you're not. Get out of
Wow. Right. Right. I'll tell you right now that something you just reminded me of as well. This is my fun fact of the day that I'm also going to deposit in this episode here. Is you brought the education system and how rigid it is. Okay. There's actually a really like daunting reason as to why the seating arrangement looks the way it does in schools. Any guesses why?
No, not offhand.
It's because, like, if you think about it, yeah, it's like it seems practical. All these chairs are sitting next to each other; they're all facing the same direction in the line, and they're all facing the teacher. So it seems practical. But technically speaking, you could actually have the school outside. You could have tables with students sitting looking at each other. There's a lot of different ways you can technically have the seating arrangements. You could also have it in a circle, but none of that fit the criteria of matching what it was like to work in a factory. Because back in the day in the industrial era, when the factories were becoming a thing, they needed to also simultaneously train kids how to manage an assembly line. And one of the best ways to do that was to start sitting them in this row, in a row together, like they were in an assembly line, like they were actually working a factory. So what better way than to simulate it while simultaneously teaching them things that they were required to teach them? So that was where we got it. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why we severely need education reform here in this country, is that uh, we haven't changed since then. It's been over 200 years. I think it's about time for us to start leaving that factory mindset, especially since robots are now replacing workers in factories. So, how about that?
Yeah. Well, do you remember Stephen Paddock? I think he's still considered the most lethal mass shooter in American history. He did the Las Vegas shooting uh,
Mm.
years ago, the one that involved the bump stock from that window down on the country
I had
music.
friends that survived that awful massacre.
Wow. Yeah, so the real revelation of the Stephen Paddock story for me was learning that he grew up just a few miles away from me in a part of the San Fernando Valley that's considered kind of the anus of Los Angeles. It's like the very edge of the city, basically, like the Sunland, Sun Valley area. It is kind of the end of the line, going north city-wise. And at that school, it was basically I don't know if this had something to do with the high Latino population, but they were basically just setting the kids up for agricultural work and factory work, and that's it. And he had a lot of Paddock, that is, had a lot of lofty ideas for himself. And yeah, I can't help but think that, yeah, forcing him into that assembly line mindset is part of what gave him some really nasty ideas.
Agreed.
All right. So, and do you want to tell us some more about your work with the Authority Hive?
Absolutely. So my company, The Authority Hive, is the marketing agency that does podcast production, and we create an ROI as sweet as honey. I have to say that every time I meet someone and talk about my business, but my business started because I had this little hobby. I had discovered when towards the end of my film career that I liked this hobby of podcasting. I would take green rooms that wasn't being used, and I would interview my coworkers when I was bored because there's nothing else for me to do. And I had a lot of fun creating this little hobby of a show at the time called the Mr. Thrive Stars of Tomorrow. And I was having a lot of fun with this little show. And then my father saw what I was doing and he said, I really like what you're doing. I want a podcast too, but I want to make it about small business.
Huh.
And I said, okay, if you really want, but why are we doing this? He says, because I think you really have a business here. I think that you can actually do this for other companies. And I said, when is another business going to need a podcast? That seems silly. And I couldn't have been more wrong because today it's opened up so many different doors for me. And my father is a huge figure in my life. He's my mentor. He's my best friend. He's my confidant. And we've been through a lot together. I'm very close to my parents. I'm an only child,
Oh,
but
wow.
I when the pandemic began, I pretty much got the crash course on how to build a business 101. And I was laid off from my daytime job at the time, which at the time was working for the Jewish Federation. And very quickly, I had to, start my life over. I learned very quickly what it was like to hit rock bottom, but thinking more about it from the grand scheme of things, like my rock bottom was with loving parents. Awesome. That's the best rock bottom I could ask for. Let's hope that's actually the rock bottom. So I continued to pursue my business, but from the confines of my room. And I learned how to network better. I learned how to produce better. I learned how to sell better. I learned how to present better. I learned how to, just be the better me overall. And so while 2020 was the worst year of everyone's life, and for me, I look back at it very fondly. I look back at it as a time, yeah, it was so difficult, unbelievably difficult, but it was also some of the most enriching growth in my life that I'm so proud of and I carry with me everywhere I go.
Excellent. Yeah, it's fascinating to see the rise of podcasting. I mean, in a way, it's kind of irritating because that means more competition for us. It's just, so There's so many out there. It's kind of the way blogs used to be, it's just total immersion. But I also feel like it's fascinating because a lot of small businesses might have been or might still be a little resistant to having an online presence, like I don't want to have a website or a Facebook page. But now it's like you're starting to see how important that is. I mean, in some ways you don't exist, at least to younger people, unless they can find you online, or find your Facebook page or something. But now, yeah, podcasting is really the best way to stay in the loop with anything. I mean, I've even heard like food truck podcasts that are so interesting. I mean, it's not my world, but it's like, wow, what a great way just to stay abreast.
Absolutely. It's about building a brand. It's about the fact that there are businesses out there that their competitors make others think that they have one type of business. And reality is there's so much nuance as to how you can go about a business that you have to actually go and explain it. And a 30-second intro on an average networking meeting isn't going to do it. So that's why it's very valuable to have a podcast that accurately talks about your brand and helps you helps people understand what you do. And then also creates what I like to call the panelist effect. The panelist effect is essentially, if you could imagine, Mr. I'm gonna for in a very cruel way refer to this type of individual as Mr. Nobody, right? Someone that's no one's ever heard of, right? It's a very evil thing to say. I don't believe anybody is nobody. Everybody is somebody, for the record. But let's say you just don't have that kind of credibility to your name, but you associate yourself with other people that have big names. So if you somehow got Kevin O'Leary on your podcast, or if you ever somehow got a large figure like Mark Cuban or any of the Shark Tank people, right? They're my favorite people to pretend. Like, if no one's ever heard of you and you ended up on the TV show Shark Tank, people would then have heard of you because of who you're associated with. That's a big deal. People think of you differently because of who you associate with. People judge you based on who you spend your time with. And a podcast is a perfect display of that. Not to mention, your podcast can also be used as a sales tool. When you can actually leverage your podcast and leverage sales based on the people that are on your show and also the listeners who are listening in, that's another way to create an indirect ROI, and it's huge.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of the nobody thing, I think I heard that from a rabbi once, that the idea of like something out of nothing, it also is like for true success. You can't just, wake up one morning, it's like, I'm a success. It's more about that struggle. You have to go from a nobody, for lack of a better word, to a somebody. And I mean, even when I learned that the word, the name of our God, Israel, literally translates to struggle. It's about our journey. It's not necessarily supposed to come easily, kind of like climbing all the rungs of Jacob's ladder. You got to go through that whole process. So kind of sad that we have to talk about this, but I couldn't believe when I saw the footage of the Pico pogrom. From what I can tell, this was the first race riot in Los Angeles since Rodney King in 1992. Were you there that day?
So I was actually not there that day. I had other plans at that time, and I actually wasn't made aware of the event until after, because I'm a little bit detached from the Pico Robertson Froome community, because I live currently in Venice, although that is soon to change. By the time people are listening to this, I might be living in Pico by then. Um, yeah, this is true. This is true. So a company or an organization was selling real estate from the land within Israel, from from land that is absolutely 100% Israel's, right? There's no other way to look at it. And they were selling it to people in a place of worship. And then our favorite, you know, quote unquote peace loving people, the pro Palestinians, who are actually not peace loving, came and blocked the place of worship because anti-Semitism is in style, and it's okay. Racism is never okay unless it's a Jew. So this took place, yeah, and I think I'm glad I wasn't there, because I know that would have emotionally incited something out of me that wouldn't have been good. And I commend the Jews that were there, who protected their right to exist, their right to worship, their right to embrace the land of Israel. And it's just absolutely insane. I think I really, really hope that these people who participate in the pro-Palestinian side look at themselves, 5-10 years from now, and realize what they've done, that they see the clarity and they feel the shame from the fact that they practiced so many double standards and did so many heinous things to a peace-loving people.
Yeah, it's truly mind-boggling to me that, the same sentiments that were used to promote the Holocaust and the blood libels and the Russian pogroms are still being repeated today. They're chanting outside of the DNC right now, "We don't want no Jewish state." And, imagine if there were people saying, no, there shouldn't be any black nations. Or, I mean, yeah, what you just said about, it's racism's never okay unless we're talking about Jews. And, it was kind of weird. I had to navigate some of that teaching with these Orthodox boys a couple of years ago because, some of them would say things that were just so shocking to me. And I'd just be like, whoa, 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 we don't use, foul language and stuff like that. And they would like kind of be like, oh, no, that's not racism. That's anti Semitism. Like, and it's just like, come on, if it's you're being hateful, you're being hateful, however you want to split the hairs. But man, it is just mind-boggling to me, not only, to see the stuff from people that are claiming to be the progressives, but also like in pop culture and whatnot. Dave Chappelle had this thing, I think it's already like 10 years old, but I heard it, driving around listening to one of the comedy stations on Sirius XM. And they were still playing it like recently. And I know like there's been a lot of cancel culture talk about Dave Chappelle over some of his trans jokes, but to hear this despicable stuff he was saying about Jewish people, and especially to have an African American appear to have no sympathy whatsoever for people that were taken in captivity, and forced out of their country. And he's making it sound like, oh yeah, we're basically I think the name of the track, most comedy bits are also, for like comedy albums, they have a track name. I think the track name that when I was listening to it on the Comedy Channel, it came up as Space Jews. So I was almost intrigued at first because it's like, oh, this should be interesting. Yeah, and then it's just like, no, you guys are basically like this alien race that goes around colonizing different planets. And to think that there was really no pushback, in the mainstream about that. And Roseanne, too, obviously she gets a pass because, I guess her father was Jewish or her parents were Jewish. I know she was really raised Mormon. But I remember Rabbi Shmuley Bodiak saying, hey, Roseanne doesn't have a racist bone in her body. And I'm thinking, well, who cares about her bones? I care about what's in her brain and her heart. But, she tweeted some joke, picture of her dressed like a Nazi, putting like Jewish gingerbread cookies into an oven. And again, no pushback about that. But then she tweets, one racist thing about Valerie Barlett, I think it was. And then she's taken off of her show. She's totally canceled. So, I mean, yeah, what's your take on this? Obviously, anti-Semitism goes back so far. It's kind of woven into the fabric of society in many ways. But I mean, what do you think? Should Jews kind of band together to try and platform people like Chappelle?
Um, do I believe in cancel culture? No, I don't. No, I don't. Because it's a slippery slope and it's very arbitrary as to what you can and can't cancel, what you should and shouldn't cancel. Um, should Jews band together? For the most part, I think by 95%, we are. We are 95% band together. You might go, well, wait a second, what about the anti-Zionist Jews? There's way more than 5%. It's like, well, actually, I think they're really, really tokenized, so much so that we think that they're more than 5%. I'm not going to give any names, any content creators that I know. There's one specific content creator I've seen that he's an anti-Zionist Jew, and he's a self-hating Jew, and he goes out there and then he shoots these videos of him being fake assaulted. And I'm not going to say his name because I don't want to support his channel. I don't want to support what he's doing. I want him to be forgotten about in the vague abyss of nothingness. But what I'll tell you is that I think all of this goes to show and prove once again, Jews don't run media. It's my favorite anti-Semitic trope because there actually is a little bit of historical relevance to it. And it's the fact that it comes from the film industry, the fact that, at the time when Warner Brothers was being created, and the time at Universal Studios was being created, MGM was being created, these were all Jews that created these companies. But if you look at Hollywood today, um, there, besides like some of the obvious names like Steven Spielberg, there's not really many Jews operating Hollywood. And for any of the naysayers out there, Hollywood is not a friendly place for Jews. I'm not talking about like, oh, it's an like all the film sets are anti-Semitic. That's not what I'm saying. It's that none of these producers out there that are creating films care that you have Shabbat dinner. None of these producers care that there's kosher food on the sets. None of these producers care how they accurately portray Jews in films. Um, I can go on. The bottom line is that the film industry, if it ever was ours once upon a time, it's not anymore. And whatever you're seeing today, I could almost guarantee you that if there's any content that's made with made about Jews, I can almost guarantee you that it's not in our favor. There was one TV show that I really, really was incredibly impressed by in terms of how Jews are portrayed in the show, and it's called The Therapist, and
Hmm.
that's with Steve Carell.
Huh.
Steve Carell actually plays the main character. Steve Carell is not Jewish, but he plays a Jewish therapist, and so the plot is that this happens all in the first episode, so I'm not ruining anything. The plot is that he's a therapist. He has a client that he's not making a lot of good progress with. He thinks it's not a good match. And he does what any therapist would do in that case, which is make a referral to a different therapist and basically fires the client. Now, what happens is that therapist, Steve Carell, gets kidnapped by the ex client and taken to some home and is he's chained to his bed. And the client explains that he couldn't appropriately explain who he is because he's a psychopath and he needs this therapist's help to recover. And so now Steve Carell in the basement of the psychopath's apartment is starting to reflect on his life. And, you know, you start to see this major contrast between Reform Judaism and Orthodoxy because he always grew up with the secular Reform world. His wife was a Reform cantor. And then the son grew up to be an Orthodox Jew. And so that creates a lot of tension, that creates a lot of cultural rifts within the family and creates a lot of divide. And I think about that show all the time, especially as I personally become more religious. But I think it was just such a wonderful display of what Judaism is like. And so one of these unique challenges that hasn't really been talked about on screen a lot are the differences of are the different backgrounds of Jews and how we navigate each other's tribalisms. Going back to that topic before, very interesting stuff.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Did you by chance see The Shrink Next Door
I have
on
not. No.
well, Will Ferrell, who often kind of irritates me, I actually like his work. I think more as a producer. He produced Succession. A lot of people don't realize. So he's like a fascinating person, but yeah, he just kind of annoyed me a lot of times. I don't always find his stuff, humorous, but he plays a Jewish character. It's based on a true story, and he gets sort of taken by this really manipulative therapist who just kind of slowly takes over his whole life. And Paul Rudd plays the vindictive therapist who actually is half Jewish. And the reason I thought of that was in part Gary Goldman, the comedian. He's kind of like a Richard Lewis type. He likes to make fun of his own like neurosis a lot. So I feel like he's of that Richard Lewis, lineage of comedians. But yeah, Gary Goldman has this hilarious joke about how, back growing up in the 80s, like being a man, it was so black and white, you had to drink Coke. If you drank Sprite, they'd be like, "What are you, some fairy?" And he mentioned like, yeah, basically you had to be a Clint Eastwood or a Richard Simmons. There was no in between. And that brings me to Paul Rudd. I brought this up to at the synagogue I was going to for a while to sort of balance out the really militant boys' high school that I was teaching at. So the rabbi at this Burbank temple mentioned to me, I was telling him the Gary Goldman joke about how binary things used to be, like in the 80s and 90s. And because Gary Goldman says in that joke, he's like, you had to choose basically between the Clint Eastwoods and the Richard Simmons. There were no Mark Ruffalo's, there were no Paul Rudds. And I'm like, yeah, Paul Rudd, that's a perfect example. And that's kind of where like reform and maybe renewal or conservative Judaism would be a better example, because a lot of people think like, hey, you're either religious or you're not. And I love hearing about some of these sort of in between schools of thought, because it's not true. Like there are happy mediums. There are Paul Rudds of Judaism, basically. Interesting.
Definitely. And on that note of what is religious versus not religious. My boss, who you might have seen go by behind me a couple of times in the past, when I was first interviewing for the chief marketing officer job at H Los Angeles, one of the first conversations we ever had was he asked me, Chaz, how religious are you? And I wasn't quite sure. I didn't really know how to define my level of religiousness. And I was trying to tell him some of the things that I practiced. And he goes, Chaz, it's not what I'm asking. And then he says, let me ask you this. Um, Break down the word religion for a second. Or break down the word religious for a second. What is the Latin root of the word religious?
Union.
And what was that?
Is it union?
No, the Latin word of the word religious.
Right. Well, I thought it was, sorry to chime in, but I thought it was religare, which means basically like bound together or.
You're pretty much on the right track, but the root is lig, Lig. And if you could think of any body part on the human body that has the word lig in it, it's ligament. So
Right.
in the ligament's job on the human body is to connect bones, right? So to be religious is actually not about your level of observance. Your observance is different than your religiosity. It really is your connection to the group. So you can have the least observant people on earth be the most religious people on earth, which is a really interesting idea, and it helps you think about the relationship that Jews have to their community and God in a very different way.
Interesting. That's kind of like the media's role in theory. It's supposed to be an intermediary, sort of that connective tissue
That's
between,
right.
yeah, the powers that be and the people. Fascinating. Okay. Well, so yeah, and speaking of religion, I mean, I get so annoyed sometimes when I see these memes going around, about taxing the mega churches, because I'm like, wow, if they raise taxes on some of these like little temples around here that are barely surviving, that could be just devastating. But they show like some of the excessive salaries of some of these pastors and reverend people like the Joel Osteens, hiding cash in their walls like they're laundering money. But I noticed there's almost never rabbis or synagogues on those lists. Why do you think that is?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't quite understand it.
Oh, just when people talk about how they should tax churches, and they act like religious people are making all this money and that, church officials are really overpaid. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have any of these memes on hand, but they're annoying because it's like never got any Jewish people on there. So obviously, what they're leaving out is that rabbis are probably not making those excessive salaries. So
Oh,
like the mega churches, why do you think that Jews don't have things like overpaid reverends? You know,
that yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think for starters, it's a really interesting question. I would say, I mean, like one could automatically jump to, well, that's a double standard, and then it's like, well, wait, what are you defending? The fact that people suddenly think you're not rich anymore, because it's kind of a nice stereotype to be spared of. Um, I think the reality is that that narrative, that kind of pushback that we hear, comes from the idea that there is a lack of separation between church and state, and it's especially depending on which political party you're with, that continues to diminish more and more. There's less and less division between church and state, as we're seeing, and so that's always a common response because there is a very clear hypocritical point. Um, but I'm definitely not an expert in that subject matter. I think it's very interesting, and I think that it's something to be aware of, definitely more aware of as time has gone on. Uh, thank God we don't have to deal with that stereotype on top of all the other awful things that we deal with as well. But when it comes to Jews being portrayed as money grabbing people, my first thought is like, okay, go to Pico Robertson then, like actually go to a real Jewish community because listen, there are some nice parts of the neighborhood, but it's really not that glamorous of a place to live. I plan to live in Pico Robertson because I want to be able to keep Shabbat and keep kosher and keep a kosher home. And a lot of that has to do with the community you're in. But I'm not doing it because it's the most luxurious place on earth. Look at the underkept streets. Look at all the work that needs to be done infrastructure wise. Look at all these little local shops that are owned by families and are really there to just help people get by. And look at all the people that have apartments that are right above their stores. There is something beautiful about that, by the way. It almost feels like the immigrant story, if you will, in some ways. People, toughing it through and scrapping by because they believe in something bigger than them. There is something really beautiful about that, but it's not the same kind of beauty that comes with making money.
Right. Yeah, there's a certain humility that I've noticed from the Jewish community. And yeah, I kind of got into that in my last podcast episode as well, trying to dispel this myth of the money grubbing Jew. I mean, you look at Jonas Salk, who didn't even take a penny in profits for creating the polio vaccine. And, these ideas that like charity, I mean, doesn't even really exist in Judaism because if you look up the meaning of charity, it means voluntary. And
Right.
in Judaism, it's mandatory. You have to give. There's so much about, the importance of giving. Uh,
And even more so, we don't have any word that translates to charity. It's actually, for us, it's called tzedakah. And tzedakah translates to the word righteous. And so, yeah, a classic basic form of tzedakah is to give money. So someone might look at that from afar and go, oh, of course that's charity. But here's another form of charity. Oh, sorry, here's another form of tzedakah to explain the difference between tzedakah and charity. One form of tzedakah is to give a person a job or to teach someone how to make their own money. So that way they can support themselves for the long term. Because handing a couple of dollars here and there, that's nice. That helps people get your average 7-Eleven meal, protein bar, gas station cookie, whatever's going to hold you for the night. But actually teaching someone to thrive on their own is the ultimate mitzvah. It's the ultimate act of tzedakah. So it's definitely something that is incredibly crucial for people to understand when it comes to differences between how Jews go about giving things versus how non-Jews will give things to the poor. Charity versus tzedakah is a stark difference between the two of them.
okay. So I know I got to let you go in a minute, but I guess my last question is, it irritates me. We teach in schools so much about the Enlightenment, but we don't talk about the Great Revival, and which was like a series of religious revivals in the U.S. And if it wasn't for religious people and coalitions getting together, I mean, we never would have had the suffragist movement, the abolitionist movement, civil rights, the labor movement, and people forget about that. And I notice, there's still just so much antagonism to religious people. So, I mean, what do you think? Obviously, even despite some of these violent attacks, we were talking about the Pico Pogrom, for example, most faiths have seen a serious decline in membership in recent years. And, Judaism is known for having so many disbelievers and non-believers and for having a somewhat difficult conversion process. So, I mean, what do you think? What can we do to increase those numbers? Should conversion be made easier? Should more secular Jews start showing up, just even if it's out of solidarity? What do you think?
Great question. So when it comes to Jewish membership, I'm just going to kind of summarize your question into two words there: the Jewish membership, Jewish attendance, Jewish demographics, and whatnot. The Torah has never said that we need to expand our numbers. As a matter of fact, it's never said that we will be great in numbers. It always, if you look at what the sages predicted about the journey of Jews, there's never been any good selling points. Some of the selling points that the sages have predicted for Jews is that will always be small in number and that will always feel like we're being hunted. And that whenever the night ends, we'll be wishing it was the day before, as in everything is getting so much worse every single day that we will always regret that we weren't in the day before. Something to that capacity. It's not a really good selling point. It's not attractive at all. Does that mean that we don't want people to be Jewish? Yeah, Jewish values are important. But first of all, proselytizing has never been a part of the Jewish faith. And that's actually one of the reasons I love Judaism, is because you're never going to get a Chabad rabbi who knocks at your door and says, hey, that's a nice Christian cross you got there in the door. I'd like to invite you to my shul tonight. You're never going to get a Chabad rabbi that does that, or any rabbi that does that. Any rabbi who does do that is probably a Messianic Christian.
Hmm.
It's probably someone who calls themselves a Jew and they're actually not Jewish. Um, the truth is, Torah Torah prioritizes authenticity over membership. And if you've never noticed a high barrier of entry into Judaism, that's intentional. It's intentional. It's because we don't prioritize numbers. We don't prioritize having a vast amount of people coming into our religion. So I've spoken to some people who have told me that they have converted to Judaism, and I've always struggled with holding my tongue because I feel bad for them. Um, there's the knee jerk reaction I want to have when they told me that they've converted, and then they tell me how they converted, and I'll say, wait, so you took an online course and you did it in an unguided way, and you paid a certain amount of money to subscription, and you think you now are Jewish? Should I say congratulations now? Um, the Jewish identity has always been sealed through the matriarchal bloodline. Always comes from the mother's bloodline. And if you do convert, you have to go through a rigorous process. Part of that process means getting rejected thrice.
And
Um,
isn't, real quick, isn't that a tradition that came out of medieval Europe because we would have been punished by execution?
so I actually don't know the origin of that, but there's all I can say is that there's a value to it. The value being that it shouldn't be easy to become Jewish because this is of all the religions that are out there, this is the one that actually has the relationship with Hashem. This is the one that we are the chosen people. So why should it be easy to acquire it? If you are of the mindset that it shouldn't be easy to acquire a gun because it has the ability to take life, then why should it be easy to convert to Judaism? You're talking about having a relationship with God, not just a God, like there is ever such a thing, because I don't believe in idolatry, right? We're talking about the infinite. So you want to have a relationship with the infinite, and you think it's going to be as easy as taking an online course? Are you kidding me? Our mission statement is to be a light unto nations, but that doesn't mean that we have to pander to making things easy for other people. It means that we have to live a lifestyle that others from the outside will admire. That's what it means to be a light unto nations. It means living a life of a tzaddik, to live the life of a righteous person that someone from afar can look at and go, wow, I don't know how they're doing it, but I want to live that life. And if you are so bold as to be curious and to try to start learning about the conversion process, then great, do that. But don't go to an organization that offers some easy shortcut around, some easy, you know, two-dimensional course that only gives you so much information. It's just not going to give you the real emet, the real truth about what Judaism is. And so I know that by saying that out loud, that's going to upset a lot of people that hear that. There's a reason why this conversion process is difficult. And it's because, once again, you're not just having a relationship with yourself. You're not just creating a relationship with the mystics of Kabbalah. You're not just reading some books and saying, oh, I completed this like Harry Potter. No, you're having a relationship with the infinite. Why should your process be any different than anyone else's? Why should it be easier? Of course it wouldn't be easy. Of course it's going to be frustrating. Of course any concept that you grew up with is going to be challenged and changed. It's not going to be a pleasant journey. And unfortunately, there are too many conversion processes out there that are so skewed into a political agenda that of course it's going to be made easy. Of course, you're going to take words and distort them and twist them. Of course, you're going to take the blessings that our ancestors and our patriarchs had said, and you're going to twist them and change them. So you're going to actually ignore their origins or where they came from, and you're not going to actually understand the real essence of where they come from and what they mean. So you're not doing the work to understand something to its fullest capacity and to understand what the foundations of Judaism is a deep and sincere flaw that actually would only kill the identity of Judaism. And that's why conversion needs to be so difficult. If you want to convert, then great. Please take the time, but understand that it's like when you're trying to convert to Judaism, it should feel like you're trying to climb Everest without oxygen.
Wow, beautifully said. The struggle is real.
The struggle is real, no pun intended. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Chaz. Really appreciate putting in this time. What are some of the best ways for people to keep up with you?
And Colin, I just gotta say it's been a treat. It's been really amazing to be on your podcast. I want to thank you for having me. As you know, just to talk about a little bit of my platform, my work, my business, my beliefs, my philosophies. It's been really, really exciting. If you want to follow me, go ahead and follow me at Bad Jew Pod. That's on Instagram and TikTok. And also, if you want to support Aish Los Angeles, go ahead. You can find us at Aish_Los Angeles on Instagram and Facebook as Aish Los Angeles. We have some really amazing events coming up here in Los Angeles. We're doing a lot of work to engage with the Jewish community and make for meaningful strides for Jewish identity as a whole. So it's been amazing.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully this is only the beginning.
Amen. Thank you so much, Colin, and
Welcome.
wishing you the best.
Okay, likewise. Take care, Chaz.
Take care. Bye.